How many properties do you actually need to retire at 55? Look, I've spent years running the numbers for property investors, and the answer might not be what you expect. So in this episode of the Property Academy podcast, you're going to learn the number of properties that you need so you can stop working and live the life you want by 55. And secondly, how to figure out what that number of properties is for you.
Now, when we ask that question, how many properties you need to retire by 55, of course, the answer is...
It depends, and we hate that answer.
But it depends on a lot of things, like if you are very, very young, so let's say you're 20 and you invest in property, you might only need a couple of properties because you've got so long in the market, whereas if you're a little bit older, you might need more properties because you need more investments. Similarly, if you want to live on a massive goal, if you want to retire on $200,000 a year, you're going to need a lot more properties than if you only want to live on $50,000 a year. So it does depend on a lot of things. But in today's show, we're going to talk about what that number depends on and how you figure out what that number is for yourself so you know it for you, rather than just saying 3, the answer's 3. Well, actually for you, the answer might be 5, the answer might be 2, it might be 1. And throughout this video, we're going to use a really cool tool called My Wealth Plan. You can access this for free within Opus Plus, and I'll put a link to it down in the description. And Andrew, let's go through an example and figure out how many properties somebody might need.
Okay, so Ed, you are 32, so let's put you as 32. But let's just call you and Ange both the same age. So both 32, both wanting to retire at 55. Lazy. And let's say that you're quite, you're happy, once you've paid off your mortgage, that you're happy to live on 75 grand a year. And let's say you'll live to 90, or at least Angela will. And you've already owned a house, and we'll say that you're paying down that mortgage, but you haven't gone out and bought any other rental properties at the moment. So we're not using real Ed example. And let's say you haven't got any Kiwisaver and you're not going to rely on that or superannuation because you won't be old enough to be able to access it. So no other assets at the moment. So your wealth gap at the moment is about $2.2 million. So what that means is for you to be able to hit that goal of being able to spend 75 grand a year from 55 to 90, which is quite a long time, you need to have saved $2.2 million between now and when you turn 55.
Okay. So let me just think about that. So if I retire at 55 or I stop working, so that's 35 years in retirement, and you reckon, or 35 years of not working, I'd need $2.2 million of today's money to spend 75 grand of today's money. Okay.
Yeah. Now, do you know that the terrifying part, this is the thing that always stands out to me whenever I'm looking at a wealth gap, is how much money you'd need to save and over what period of time. So because in this example, you're saving between 32 and 55, which is, relatively short period of time for a large amount of money, means you'd have to save $92,000 a year. So think about what you'd have to do to pay tax on money and have $92,000 left over. Not many people have that.
Yeah, would basically have to, one of us would probably have to save more than just one person's income. Now, let's say that you were investing in property, and in this case, let's just focus on, the capital growth. You buy a property and properties tend to go up in value. We'll ignore the cash flow for a moment, but we'll come back to it. How many properties would you assume that somebody would need?
My pure guess might be you might need 3, but let's just try it out. So let's add a property. Where would you want to invest in first?
Well, typically we say that Auckland properties tend to increase in value a bit faster.
That would be my recommendation right now. Let's say $700,000 property bought in Auckland today, and let's use the no cash needed method. So borrowing 700 grand and an interest-only mortgage. You might pay down debt once your mortgage is gone, but let's just say once your personal mortgage is gone. Okay, that makes a pretty big dent towards your retirement goal.
So what we're saying here is if you bought a property in Auckland, and let's say it goes up by 6% a year, by the time we get to the year that I want to stop working in this example, that might be worth about $1.1 million worth of equity within that property in this projection. And I get that. That sounds like a lot of money, but it's because, we're modeling this over 23 years. So you'd expect that it might more than double in value over that time. Okay.
Let's add in another property in Auckland. Now, I know that's not very good from a diversification standpoint because you've got a house in Auckland and then have 2 rentals in Auckland, but we've got a relatively ambitious retirement goal, i.e. retiring so early. So we need as much growth as possible. Let's say you do that in 2 years' time or 3 years' time. And let's say you spend $800,000 on the next one. and we'll make that mortgage 800,000 as well. So again, no cash needed. Okay, cool. You want to walk us through what you see?
So what I'm saying here is that if I bought 2 properties, so that's about $1.5 million worth of assets. And if I held on to those for 23 years, and this is the important thing, and they went up by 6% per year, which is actually slightly slower than Auckland property prices have increased in the past, then that would get me to my goal, and I'd be on track to be able to spend about $77,000 a year in retirement, assuming the assets performed in that way.
Now, you might be thinking, well, that's interesting that Andrew has recommended or suggested quite an aggressive approach to just Auckland alone. Now, let me show you why in this instance. So if you could buy something with a lower capital growth rate, so around the rest of the country, we don't assume a 6% growth rate. Let's say you bought a property, your first one was in Christchurch, and we made it a 5% capital growth rate.
And we'll do this we'll do it for both properties, change them both to a 5% rate. So if you change both of them to 5%, for instance, well, I'm not on track for 77 grand anymore. I'd be on track for $57,000. And so one thing that really impacts the number of properties that you need is, well, what do you want to assume that it's going to increase in value by? If you wanted to be really conservative and say, I reckon that properties prices are only going to go up by 3% or 4%, you guys can use this calculator right now for free. So feel free to put that in. What it will show is the lower return you think you're going to get from the market, then the more properties, the more investing that you would need to do. And that's just the maths of it.
Yeah, and actually this reminds me of an investor I met with just last week who has been very driven on cash flow. And that's just purely because of what he'd seen on the internet. So he's gone out and bought 2 really high yielding properties. Now, don't get me wrong, these are awesome yielding properties, but they haven't gone up in value very much. And so what he's realized now is because he's got ambitious goals and wants to be retiring early like this example, if we don't add some good growth properties in there, the cash flow is great, but it's not going to fund his lifestyle.
That's really interesting. The other big thing that impacts this is time in the market. So we've assumed here that I am 32, which I actually am 32, but that means that we've got 23 years worth of investing to hit this goal. Now, let's say that I'm a little bit older. I'm now 40 years old and I want to still retire at 55. Well, if I start at 32, I'll be on track for 56 grand, again, if they go up by 5%. But if I only had 15 years of investing, then these properties would only get me to $27,000 rather than closer to $57,000. And I like to bring that up because we're talking about the same properties, the same growth rates, but you obviously make substantially less money if you hold those properties for a shorter time. So what impacts the number of houses you're going to need to retire at 55? Well, how old are you now? If you're younger, 32, hey, you don't need as many properties. If you're going to do it within 15 years, you might need easily 5.
Well, the thing I always find really fascinating when you look at the numbers of it is, okay, you shaved 7 years off your plan, I think it was, so from 22 to 15 years. So you shaved roughly a third off your plan, but you've gone down to about half of the income.
And that's because returns compound over time. So I always say, if you, in any investment, you make the least amount of money in the first year, you make the most amount of money in the last year, and that's because your returns compound. And one thing that hopefully will make a little bit of a sense is I looked at how much money would you need to save per week in order to save $1 million by age 55. And I'm talking about inflation-adjusted $1 million. So if you started at 54 and you wanted to save $1 million by age 55, you're going to have to save roughly about $19,000 a week, right? Because you're going to have to save it all. The market's not going to give you much of a return. Now, if you give yourself double the amount of time, so you've got 2 years to save that $1 million, now you're going to be saving roughly about, just over $10,000. The number's quite small on the screen, but I think it's about $10,000 a week. The more time you give yourself, the less you need to save per week. So if you wanted to save, $1 million of today's money from age 32 to 55, you'd need to save $612 a week. Now, that's still a lot of money. I'm not saying it's not a lot of money, but what's interesting is how much, the less time you have, the more you need to save per week. And it really starts to curve up. Did that surprise you when I first showed you that graph?
When you showed me this graph, I questioned you, which is always a mistake, because how steep that curve goes is really, really surprising. But you rightly pointed out, of course, there's a smart one, that, if you're talking about, only having a couple of years from your end goal, you have to save really, really aggressively. If you improve your runway, then obviously that reduces the amount that you put in. It's just surprising how steep that is.
And that's the reason why I say the earlier you start, the kind of easier it is. The other thing that makes quite a large difference is the order that you buy your properties in. So, for example, let's say, and this is where it gets a bit strange. So, if you are really wealthy, you actually might not need to buy as many properties as if you are on a lower income. And the reason is, if you're a doctor, if you're a surgeon and you're 40 years old today, you might be able to go out and buy 3 properties like that today. If you're on a lower income, and I think about we helped 2 investors who both worked at Pak'nSave, right? And they started investing in property. And I just love that story. But if they buy their first property, it's going to be more difficult to buy their second and third. It's going to take them some time to get in the position where they can buy their next investment property. But what that means is if you're the surgeon who can buy 3 properties straight away, well, you're able to have maybe $1.5 million, $2 million of assets today that are potentially going up in value. Whereas if you're the Pak'nSave property investors, and I love them, by the way, if they're listening, but it's going to take you some time to build that portfolio so you don't have as many assets going up all at the same time. Just to put some numbers around that, let's say you wanted to retire at 55 and you are going to start at age 30. So you've got 25 years. Well, if you can go out and buy 2 properties straight away, well, you'll own property 1 for 25 years. You'll own property 2 for 25 years. So you've got a total of 50 years worth of investing, if you put it together. Now, if you don't have quite as high an income or as much equity and you can't go out and buy 2 properties straight away, maybe you buy property number 1 today. Cool, we're going to hold that for 25 years. 10 years later, you buy your second property. Well, this time you've only got 15 years until your retirement because you're buying that one at age 40. Okay, so you hold that for 15 years. 5 years after that, you're 45. You buy your third property. You hold that for 10 years until you're 55. Now, if you add that up, property number 1 was 25 years, property number 2 was 15 years, property number 3 was 10 years. It's still 50 years of investing, but that was 3 properties that we had to hold. And so it's kind of unexpected, but sometimes if you've got the income to invest lots up front, that means you don't have to invest as much overall. You don't need to buy as many properties overall. And so the sequence of how quickly you can accumulate your assets also impacts how many you're going to need.
The interesting thing, just from actually what I see investors do all day, every day, and don't get me wrong, there's plenty of rich, like really high income earners that ramp up their property investment portfolio fast. But I think there's actually more drive from some of the people that earn the lower incomes to get ahead faster because they know they don't really have much of a choice, because if they don't do it now, who knows when they can do it. And as such, that's their solution. Whereas often people that earn high income are guilty of being busy and kick the can down the road and think we've got plenty of time on our side. But this is a great way of actually saying that time can be your friend, but it can also be your enemy.
The other thing that can really impact how many properties you need is the other investments you have. So obviously this is a property show, and we've primarily talked about property in this plan so far because this is a property show. But property is not the only way to invest. So let's say that you've been investing in sharesies, and let's say that you've already built up a really nice portfolio of $50,000 worth of shares, and you're putting away $300 per week in there, and you're getting a really good aggressive return. Well, if you chuck that in, over the next 23 years, you might build a share portfolio of about $500,000 if you're putting aside that money and your money's going up in value. Well, if that's the case, you don't need as many properties. Maybe you only need one, or maybe you only need two, or a lower number if you've got all of these other investments as well. And so we say, how many properties do you need? But it depends on lots of things. How big is the income going to be? How quickly are you going to purchase them? How much time have you got between now and when you want to realize that income and start living off it? What about your other assets? So it can impact a lot. And you know, Andrew, I was quite nervous about releasing this tool and putting it within Opus Plus because it's pretty sophisticated. You can add almost any type of investment in here, but it's also easy for people to make mistakes.
Yeah, one of the key things I think you got to remember is, so in the last example he gave, he put a Sharesies account. What he didn't put is his Kiwisaver or superannuation. Now, Ed's too far away from the superannuation that I don't think it'll exist in its current format. We've done podcasts on that before. So if I were Ed's age, or even at my age, I wouldn't be factoring that into my plan, but that's something you can decide for yourself and include it or not include it. But the Kiwisaver is a big one because Kiwisaver is tied to that age of eligibility. Now, if that age gets pushed out to 67 or 70, if you plan on retiring at 55, 60, or even 65, maybe, depending on how long you've got, you might not have access to that money. And so you need to consider this when you are putting together your plan, because you might have a really chunky Kiwisaver building up, but if you can't get access to it, well, you're going to have to keep working.
That's right. And so one thing that you might like to do is when you create, if you jump in, try this tool out. Once you've created a plan, you can book in a free session with an Opus financial advisor just to double check your plan and make sure that you haven't made any mistakes. Because the worst thing would be if you created a plan, you'd made the numbers incorrect in a way that actually it wasn't even accurate. And then you get to retirement and you think, hey, where's all my money? I thought I was supposed to be able to live on this income. So it's very important, create your plan, but also get it checked. And the reason I wanted to give this away is in our book, Wealth Plan, which is right behind you actually, Andrew, we talk about the importance of creating a wealth plan. And I wanted to give people the tools so that they can kind of see this for themselves without having to talk to a financial advisor. So if you want to check this out, go to Opus Plus. If you don't have an Opus Plus account, I'll put a link down in the show notes, or to be honest, if you just Google Opus Plus, it's going to be the first thing that comes up. Create your free account, and it's in the My Wealth Plan section. You just click Create a Wealth Plan, and you start creating a wealth plan, and that's kind of how it works. One thing I would just say is just remember that any plans you create are not going to be like that in real life. And what I mean by that is if you put in that house prices go up by 5% or they go up by 6%, the model, the calculator will say, okay, that house is going to go up by 5% or 6% every single year. Same with your shares, depending on what growth rate you put in there. But it's not going to be like that in real life, is it? Like house prices don't go up by exactly 5% every single year. They don't go up by exactly 6% every year. So it's important to review that plan as you go along. So you don't think, great, all I have to do, buy $1 million property, wait for it to double in value. Oh yeah, computer says that'll happen in 15 years. Turn up 15 years later, where's my $1 million, mate? So obviously it doesn't work like that. So just be careful and be conservative with the numbers you put in there as well, because if you put rubbish data in, you'll get rubbish data out.
So now you know how many properties you might need to retire by 55, but you've also got to figure out if you can even afford these properties. So if you want to start or grow your property investment portfolio, you've got to watch this next video where you'll learn how to use one house to buy 5 more.